Hi, I'm Donna and welcome to part 5, the final part of my beginner-friendly series on how to turn your quilt top into an official quilt. We'll continue the binding process where I'll show you how to finish your quilt by machine and by hand. Machine binding. If you decide to sew by machine, I like to secure the binding to the back of the quilt with clips. Make sure the folded edge goes over the stitches we made when we attach the binding to the front of the quilt. When you get to a corner, you'll fold one end first and then the other to create a crisp, mitered corner. Once the clips are all in place, there are two options to sew it to the quilt. Option 1. Sewing from the front of the quilt. You'll slowly stitch in the ditch so you're sewing next to the folded edge of the binding. What's great about this option is that your stitches aren't as noticeably visible from the front. However, it can be tricky to tell how much binding you're catching in the back. Here's an example of this option where the binding stitches are hard to see from the front of the quilt, but when we look at the back, you can see an area where I almost missed the binding. You can also see that the binding, when seen from the back, has the potential to look less neat. Option 2. Sewing from the back of the quilt. You'll be sewing on the binding itself next to its folded edge. This is a great option because you can actually see the binding getting sewn to the quilt. On the other hand, your stitches can be more visible on the front of your quilt, so keep that in mind. To increase sewing accuracy, one way to prevent this outcome is to apply washable glue, which will help keep the binding temporarily in place. Whichever option you decide, backstitch at the beginning and at the end to reinforce your stitches. Hand binding. For hand binding, we'll be sewing invisible stitches. So while this option may be slower than machine binding, this can create a clean look on both sides of the quilt. I use 40 or 50 weight thread for binding. To hide the stitches nicely, I would suggest a thread color that matches the binding fabric. I'm only using a contrasting color for visual clarity. With about 20 inches of thread, thread the needle and double or triple knot at the end. I typically just wrap the end a couple times around my finger and roll it out with my thumb to create a knot. Now you can position your quilt this way or in this orientation, whichever feels more comfortable to you. How to begin. Beginning from the raw edges of your quilt, take your needle through the backing fabric and come up right by the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure your needle never goes through the quilt top layer. Then continue your needle through the folded edge of the binding. Next, take your needle through the backing fabric only, just under where your thread landed. Then you'll bring it forward and up through the folded edge of the binding. Continue doing this, removing the clips as you go. My stitches are about a 1/4 inch apart, but you might want yours closer if you prefer a stronger, tighter seam. Notice that I'm using my non-dominant hand to keep the binding tight. This is important so that my stitches are firmly secured to the quilt while I sew. For corners, I like to close up that folded corner of the binding. To do so, continue the same stitching method, but when you get to the very corner, bring the needle back down to the inner corner of the binding. Then I just continue my stitches towards the next side of the quilt. How to exit. If your thread is starting to feel too short and difficult to manage, then we need to make an exit by creating a knot to hide under this binding. Take a tiny piece of the backing fabric only and go up. Repeat it again, but this time take your needle through the loop to create a knot. Then take your needle through the binding fabric to the very edge so we can hide that knot. Snip and rub that area until the thread peeking out disappears. How to re-enter. When your needle is freshly loaded with new thread, re-entering is similar to how you started. You'll take the needle through the backing fabric underneath the binding, then direct your needle through the folded edge of the binding right before your last stitch to reinforce that area. Then you'll just continue stitching and make sure to go 2 to 3 stitches past your very first stitch. You'll repeat the exit technique creating a knot on the backing fabric only next to that folded edge, and then taking your needle outwards so the knot is hidden underneath the binding. Again, I'm using black thread for clarity, but you can see that the binding stitches aren't noticeably visible on the back or the front of your quilt. Well, there you have it. We've turned a quilt top into a finished quilt. Thank you so much for watching and joining me in this adventure. If you like this series, please like and subscribe to my channel for more quick and comprehensive tutorials.